Okay, ladies, well, we're coming down the home stretch here, starting session 6, we've got 3 more to go in this series, so let's open in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you that we are able to gather together here. We pray for those who are not, for various reasons, and you know all those things, and we commit all of their concerns, and I know that they would all like to be here. But Father, just care for them and the various things that they have need of today, and perhaps even this very moment. They need something from you as an encouragement. Father, we pray for ourselves, that you would lift our hearts as we look at your word, that would just every fresh look would just fill us more with an appreciation for who you are and how much you've done for us, and your great love, your great wisdom, your great power, just all the things that you are. And we thank you that we have this opportunity to do this together. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, so I asked you to look at that little comparison sheet with Colossians and Ephesians and to find all the similarities you could. So what did you find in section A?
Paul's an apostle of Christ. It was the will of God that he become apostle.
Right. This wasn't by any accident. He is who he is by the will of God, and so are we.
Right.
And actually, it's not too surprising that you would find the opening similar. It was kind of a common way to identify yourself and to start a letter in that day. But nonetheless, it's interesting to see. You just take out the place name and substitute the other place name, and pretty much it's the same.
Mm-hmm.
All right, but how about B? How many things did you find in Ephesians that relate to the idea of the hope laid up for you in heaven from Colossians?
I think he predestined us for adoption to himself as sons.
Okay, that gives us great hope. He has adopted us. He chose us. Okay, anything else?
Just being blessed in heavenly places.
In heavenly places, yeah. Ephesians, all the blessings in the heavenly places. We have them all. We have hope because we're not just chosen, but we're holy and blameless, from verse 4 of Ephesians, and that we have redemption and forgiveness, from verse 7. So a lot of things that give us hope when we go back and remind ourselves of these things. All right, now, C had a lot of similarities. I told you the opening and closing is perhaps the most obvious, but there's others. So what kind of similar ideas did you find in section C?
I've not ceased to pray for you.
All right, I haven't ceased to pray for you. From the day I heard about your faith, now you realize the Colossians he had never met. Ephesians he helped plant that church. But these people he had never met, but when the first day he heard about this body of believers, he said, oh, that was thrilling. I haven't stopped praying for you. That is amazing. When I was, one of my, well, she wasn't a roommate in college, but she was my dorm counselor in college. And then we were roommates for a year while her husband was overseas, deployed overseas, and we lived together. That's obviously just before I met Tom. But years later, I would see her and she would say, I pray for you every day, I still do. And I thought, why? You know, I mean, I couldn't understand why, but she did. And here's Paul's another one of those faithful prayer warriors, you know. Okay, what else did you find?
Well, prayers for wisdom in the one book, and then in the other was prayers for knowledge and revelation. Knowing God, that you may know him better.
And that gives you wisdom. So sort of like one is the fruit of the other. Okay, anything else? He wanted them both to know something about the power of God. I think I kind of color coded mine. Okay, in verse 11 of Colossians on the left-hand side, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might,
Mhm.
and so on and so on. And then you find across the way in Ephesians, in verse 19, I want you to know the immeasurable greatness of his power according to the working of his great might. There's that phrase again.
Mhm.
What kind of power? The kind of power that raised Christ from the dead. Now
Just
there's
that.
power for you.
Immeasurable.
You know?
That's a big one.
So yeah, so a lot of similarities here, and these kinds of things that he's praying for them. He gives thanks for them, he tells both bodies. And then he says something significant about Christ. He says that he's the head of the church, which is his body, in both passages. All right, and then down in D, I said basically this is alienation versus reconciliation. So what kind of phrases do you see on both sides that talk about alienation?
You who once alienated and hostile in mind.
Okay, and doing evil deeds. Well, that's gonna alienate you from God right off the bat there. And probably the brother that you're doing evil deeds against. Okay. Right. How about on the other side? What kinds of things shout alienation to you?
Separated from Christ.
Separated from Christ. And then the very word, alienated.
Alienated from the commonwealth.
And then up in the third line, uncircumcision. Remember that's that derogatory reference, you Gentiles, you're uncircumcised.
But far off.
Far off,
Everyone's far off.
yes. And then down in verse 14, it talks about what Christ has done. He's broken down that dividing wall of hostility. And again, in the very last three words of that section, killing the hostility. So yes, there was great hostility between man and man, between man and God.
Right.
So what kinds of things do you find about reconciliation? But now, what?
Been brought near.
We've been brought
I like that
near,
part.
yes,
By the blood.
by the blood. He's made us both one. No longer that divided wall, we're now one. And then he reconciled both of us to God. So he brought us together, he brought us to God. Yeah. And then again, in the Colossians thing, through him, through Christ, that's how that happened, the reconciliation. And you're now holy and blameless and above reproach. So just some wonderful, wonderful things there. Okay. In sections E and F, if you didn't find similarities.
There's so many.
There's so many, yeah. And it's almost word for word in some phrases.
Yeah.
Okay, and the interesting thing is you do not find either of the things that you find in these sections in other books. I mean, you may find the ideas here and there, but not worded like this and put together like this. This is unique, kind of, to these two books. And so it's interesting not only to look at what's similar, but what is different. In Colossians, it starts out, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. On the other side, it says, be filled with the Spirit. Well, if you're in the Word, you're going to be learning more, and then you become yielded to the Spirit. Those two things are very closely related. And then talking about either teaching and admonishing, or just addressing one another, but using music, the words of music, to build each other up. I think, Debbie,
Yeah,
there you
love those
are.
parts.
There's your calling, you know. But all of us can do that, to have a song for the occasion, you know. That there's just something about those songs and hymns and spiritual songs, and to teach ourselves. You know, how often have you sung a song through tears because you needed the truth of it, and maybe you couldn't even get it out, you know.
Right.
But we need it. So it's interesting because you don't find that psalms and hymns and spiritual songs anywhere else like this, but doing that. And it's interesting that in Colossians, Paul's kind of focusing on what you do. In verse 17, he says, whatever you do, in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus. Whereas in Ephesians, he's kind of addressing more their attitude. giving thanks always and for everything to God the Father. But again, you can do that if you have a thankful spirit, you know, so interesting to see what's the same, interesting to see what's a little bit different. Okay, and then how about the last part? Well, again,
That's the same thing.
you got all this advice to husbands and wives, to children and parents, to slaves and masters.
Right.
And again, it's interesting, he followed the same order in both.
Yeah.
He's got 3 pairs, and he always starts with the person under authority first, the wives, the children, the servants. But then he addresses those in authority, saying, you handle your authority correctly, the way Christ handles his authority. You love that wife, the way I love the church. You don't provoke your children, because I don't provoke mine, you know. And I reward my servants, so you make sure you acknowledge them and don't treat them harshly. So very, very interesting. It was cute last night, one of the gals said, well, I noticed that the Colossians thing was just a little bit longer. I said, actually, it's not. If you see all the dots in the Ephesians, I left out all the, he goes into a lot more detail about these things in Ephesians. Colossians is sort of a summary of the teaching. But, so those are the ones that you look for and found, but again, we want to go back and look for the gospel in this one. It occurs exactly twice in this book, although the concepts are there, and they're both on your sheet. So the first one is on the front page, the very last word in verse 5. So you can take your yellow highlighter and highlight that gospel. And then you flip it over, and it's about the middle of the page, in the middle of verse 23, not shifting from the hope of the gospel. So then you can use your yellow highlighter to do gospel. Down about the middle of the page, in the middle of verse 23. Okay, in both cases, gospel in this book is tied to hope. Right here, you see hope of the gospel, so circle hope with your orange pencil, and then kind of draw an arrow or circle the phrase or something, because gospel and hope are tied together. And then if you flip back, if we start at the beginning of verse 5, because of the hope laid up for you in heaven, of this, of what? Of this hope you have heard before in the word, the gospel. So again, circle hope and then draw an arrow from hope to gospel, because Paul is linking, that's what gives us hope, you know. And that's why we need to keep reminding ourselves of the gospel, because we all continually need hope, fresh hope. So he's giving that to these people. All right, let's see, I think that is everything. That brings us then, we have a new thing on Colossians. So I've given you a new sheet with a purple banner at the top. Using the theme of Colossians, that Jesus Christ is supreme over every man and everything. But as I was looking at these similarities, the thought crossed my mind, okay, Colossians and Ephesians are very similar in content. So why do you think Paul wrote 2 separate books, covering much of the same material, and even using many of the very same phrases? Well, there's probably a number of reasons we could come up with. After all, there are 4 gospels, and we said that gave us 4 different kind of glimpses of Christ. So what is Paul's purpose in sending 2 books that are very similar? Well, we're going to start out with, he probably intended for the 2 groups to read each other's letters. And we gather this from a similar situation between the believers in Colossae and another town called Laodicea, which is mentioned 4 times in the book of Colossians, and I've given you those 4. In Colossians 2:1, he says, I want you to know how great a struggle I have for you and for those at Laodicea and for all who haven't seen me face to face. So apparently Paul has never been to either of those 2 towns. And then in chapter 4, he says, Epaphras, who is one of you, native of Colossae, has worked hard for you and for those in Laodicea. So again, he's worked hard, he's kind of like a traveling evangelist or something, going back and forth between these two towns. And then give my greetings to the brothers at Laodicea. And then the last one says, and when this letter, that is this book that we know as Colossians, has been read among you, have it also read in the church at Laodicea, and see that you also read their letter. We don't have that letter, but Paul wrote one. So I thought it would be interesting just to kind of give you a visual on this. Okay, we start out with, gotta start out with this one, yeah. The Mediterranean Sea. As you know, Israel's over here, and Antioch is somewhere over in this vicinity, and Paul spent a lot of his time traveling along the coast and visiting towns along the coast. What we're going to focus on is this little area right over here. And if we get a close-up of that, you can see that these towns are very close together. This star is Colossae, and this star is Laodicea, and then over here is Ephesus. So kind of think of Fowlerville and Weberville, Colossae and Laodicea, and maybe Williamston or Okemos would be over here, but still pretty close. And in fact, when you look at the 7 churches of Revelation, Laodicea is one of those churches. And the others, like Philadelphia and Sardis, and those, they're all kind of ringing this area. And they intended for those letters to be read to each other. So that brings us back then, well, if Paul intended the people to see both letters, why write so much that was the same? So, as I said, there's probably many reasons, but at least here's some things I observed, and that's this. Both books talk about Christ being the head of his body, the church. And we know that the church is also called the bride of Christ. And we know that the teaching on the marriage relationship that he talks about in great detail is a picture of our relationship with Christ. In fact, we know that, but Paul actually spells it out in Ephesians 5. He says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound. But I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. Okay, so he leaves us in no doubt about that. So, what I look at, or what I see as I look at Ephesians, is an emphasis on the bride. He starts out with a whole chapter of these spiritual blessings that God has just poured out on this bride that he loves so much. And he says he desires above else in Ephesians 5:27, Christ wants to present the church. He wants to present his bride to himself in splendor. And so you see a lot of emphasis. And I think that's why there was so much more detail given about all the relationships. He's talking to his bride about how he wants his bride to relate to other people around her. Whereas Colossians exalts our bridegroom. It's not that Ephesians doesn't. Certainly he talks about Christ in a wonderful way. But the whole, if you read through Colossians, and I've given you some specific passages you can go home and look up, just how he presents Christ as head over everything. He's supreme over angels. He's supreme over this. He's the head of everything. And so it's like one is two sides of the same coin, the marriage picture. One for the bride and one for the groom. And it kind of made me think of the Song of Solomon. I don't know how long it's been since you've read that, but that's just filled. Each of the two is just enthralled with the other one. Thrilled. The very appearance. They just go on and on about how handsome the groom is, how beautiful the bride is. And I feel like that's what's happening. How wonderfully the bride has been blessed, he says to Ephesus. And how wonderful the bridegroom himself is for her. A match made in heaven. So, just kind of interesting to, when you see things twice, you wonder why. And maybe there's others. But that blessed me just to think about it in that way. Okay, so for next week, we're gonna start on the book of 1 Thessalonians. You can read some background material on it. And again, I've given you the entire book. Because there's some things, we've got lots of colors you're gonna put on it, blue and green, purple and orange and red and so on. But we're also gonna come back to it at the very end of this, in the spring. So, hang on to this one and we will come back to it, but for next week, you have some things to work on there. So with that, we can go to our B.L.E.S.S book. And we'll start on page 96, one page in. And I appreciated what the point that he made in the box. What if you let them serve you? And the counselor once told me, Dave, if you really want to make good friends with someone, ask them to do something for you. You know, we think about service being the other direction. What can we do to help them? And that's certainly part of our Christian walk, is being a blessing to others. But sometimes that blessing is getting them involved in your life. And I think, again, when I think about when we remodeled our chimney, all the neighbors, you know, this one gave us the power washer, this one loaned us a ladder, this one brought scaffolding, this guy worked 3 whole days alongside, you know? And then not only that, but he said, hey, in the spring, because I said something, the last thing that remains to be done to get our front yard really presentable is to take care of this little jungle that's grown up around the tree by our driveway. The original people have planted some pretty flowering ground cover, but now poison ivy and a bunch of unwanted guests have taken root there. So we need to probably just rip the whole thing out and redo it. He says, hey, I can help with that. Poison ivy doesn't bother me that much, you know. He's got this app on his phone. He took pictures. If he takes pictures of a leaf, it'll tell what kind of plant it is, you know. So he told me what it is that's planted there that I like, you know. But anyway, but that's him helping us. But it's building that relationship. And I think sometimes we're too proud to admit that we need something. Let somebody help you, you know? So, that's, you know, because no matter which way it's flowing, it's building that relationship. You're spending time together in a profitable way. So I like that. And then the other thing I wanted to address on this page is, in the last sentence above the little thing at the bottom, talking about paradigm shifts. I don't know about you, but the word paradigm is kind of, I mean, we know sort of what it is. But anyway, I just looked it up just to give you a formal definition. A paradigm is a pattern or an example or a model of something. And it's not one of those words that we use a lot. I remember when I was single, there was a college professor from Cedarville that would occasionally preach at my church. And I always spent the first 15 minutes gearing my mind up, because if he could use a 5-syllable word, he would instead of a 2-syllable. I mean, that was just the way he was. Career. You know, it was his career, I guess, and you know, he was familiar with those things, but I always had to ramp up and then I could kind of follow his sermon. But anyway, paradigm. And I thought of a couple of things. You know, our forefathers, when they, back in 1776 or whenever, when they were creating a new government, they did a major paradigm shift from a monarchy with a king that inherited his position to an elected president. They didn't grow up with that system. They made a major paradigm shift, and we've all benefited from that, I guess. You might say down through the years. Another one that came to my mind, there's an author that has impressed Tom and I a lot. He's written a number of books. His name is Atul Gawande. His parents are from India. And he's a surgeon, a brain surgeon, but he's also a writer. and he writes like a novelist. I'm fascinated with his books, but he's got one book that sounds utterly boring. It's called The Checklist Manifesto, but it is so fascinating about how checklists have just revolutionized certain industries, like the airline industry. But he talks specifically about surgery. He was part of a team that was asked by the World Health Organization to come up with something, some procedures, a checklist, if you will, that will reduce the amount of error in hospitals, like in the third world or anywhere. And so he did. And then in the last chapter of his book, he says, I felt like in order not to be a hypocrite, I'd better put this into practice in my own team. Not that I really expected to find a lot of error, I mean, in my surgeries, but they did. One of the things on that checklist is the team, when they first assemble, they introduce themselves. Because what typically happened in the past was the people might know the surgeon, but he didn't know the name of the nurse or the anesthetist or the other people. But when they introduce themselves and, I'm so-and-so and I'm doing the anesthesia, I'm so-and-so and I'm doing this, it created a team, and so they all took more ownership of the entire thing. The other thing they introduced in this new procedure, the surgeon is no longer God. Anyone in the room has the right to stop things if they see a concern. And in fact, before the cut is ever made, they go around and say, do you have a concern? Do you have a concern? Do you? And in so doing, they've caught a lot of little things and big things. And the amazing thing is that no matter whether it's third world or America or anywhere in between, any hospital that has adopted these procedures has seen a dramatic reduction in error. It's a paradigm shift. No longer one man or woman, has all the last say. The whole team matters, and they are a team. I thought, there sounds something biblical about that, about doing things as a group, as a team. But, so those are just some paradigm shifts that came to my mind, and sometimes it's a change in procedure, a different model of government, a different example of how to do things. But have any of you experienced that? I think that's one of the questions at the end of the chapter. Have you experienced a major paradigm shift that stands out?
Kind of a negative one is
Yes.
as far as our country changing so much from what is Christian to so much other junk. Just it has shifted a lot of people's thoughts, the way they were brought up, the schools, whatever. It's all shifted.
Yes. The expectations, the perception of what is good and what is bad, and so on. I'll tell you one that's a personal one for me, and it was the way I viewed what I was doing. When I first went to Bangladesh, I was a school teacher in the school for the MKs. And then over time, the need for that school ended when a good school for the Bengali kids came along that was using American materials, American standard, and so our MKs just started going to that school. But at the same time, one of our ladies who had started a language school for new missionaries so they could learn Bengali, retired, and so I inherited the mantle there of supervising that school. Well, this woman, her name is Lynn Silvernail, and she is a gifted linguist. She's actually the one that wrote our Bengali textbook. She probably, and I say this in all seriousness, knows more about the Bengali language even than a lot of Bangladeshis do, because she studied the grammar and she's done it with her linguistic training. And so we got the benefit of that. So she wrote 35 lessons, and then eventually they were loose leaf, and then they were eventually bound into a book. Well, then for each lesson, she came up with some exercises to practice the new stuff. Well, the cheapest way to add that was just to put it in at the back. And then, she also thought, well, hey, you know what else would be good? If we had a story for each lesson that incorporated a lot of the new vocabulary and whatever new concept is being taught. So the stories got put in the back. And then there were some other things that got put in the back. And so by the time the book was finished, the index, you know, that thing that you refer to see what's, it's way inside the book, you know? I can't even find it here, but I mean, it is way inside the book. And the problem I saw as I sat in the classroom was that my poor students were just flogging this book. Okay, they're in lesson 7. Okay, now let's look at the exercises. Okay, now let's go to the story, you know, and now let's do this, you know, and they're just back and forth and back and forth. And the other thing that I recognized was a problem as after some time was that you didn't get any verbs until lesson 7. Do you know how hard it is to make a sentence with no verbs? I got that complaint all the time, and so I'm thinking, man, if we could just revise this book and make it more user-friendly. I mean, the material is great, it's fabulous. I could never have produced this book, you know. But the thought of revising a textbook, I mean, this is not a little pamphlet. This is a 340 some or 50 some page book. And yet, I go back into the classroom and just see that my students struggling, you know. But when I thought about that, I mean, who am I to revise a textbook? I can teach from one, I have for years, but this is a whole other ball game. And 3 words came to my mind. The first one was huge. This is a huge job. The second one was daunting, utterly daunting. And the third one was impossible. No way, you know. But then it was very interesting. It was like one day, and it was just very sudden. It was like God flipped a switch in my brain. And I suddenly thought of this task as not huge, but God-sized. This is a God-sized thing. And as soon as that phrase popped into my head, I thought, okay, if you bring God into it, it's no longer daunting, it's exciting, because that means he wants to do something here. And it's gonna be fun to find out what he wants to do. And if God is in it, is anything impossible with God? No. All of a sudden it became doable. And so I had 3 students at the time. They were all in different lessons. So what I did, I started with the 3 lessons immediately that would come next, that they would be in next, to prepare those. And it was just amazing what God did. One new thing I wanted to incorporate into the book was adding some Bible stories. I wanted them to read kind of basically through the book of Mark, because I thought if you're going to be out there, you need to be getting familiar with the Bible and how to use it. And so we're just right from get-go, we're going to start reading parts of it. It was amazing. I can't tell you the number of times that new vocabulary or the new grammar construction would be in the very next section of Mark. And I couldn't plan that. That was a God thing, you know? One thing I did plan though, if you look through this book, if you're like me, it bothers you that there's not that many pictures in it. There's a few. In my book, there are pictures, you know? Because to me, that just adds to the fun. And that was my reward. If I was tired and too tired to think about the grammar part and making revisions there, I'd work on the pictures, because for me, that was just fun. But it all happened because of a paradigm shift that happened in my mind. From viewing something as huge to viewing it as God-sized and expecting him to do something about it. So hopefully that will be a blessing, you know, to many students.
So this seems like a paradigm shift for me.
Yes.
Okay.
Like I said, I'm gonna fix people,
Yes.
or am I gonna love them
Yeah.
and bless them?
Yes. And that
That was a biggie for me, and it still is.
Yeah, and that's encouraging to hear.
Mhm.
You know, because, you know, I I want to bless you. I want what we talk about in this class to be valuable and to be helpful and to be real. Like, not fluff, like
Yeah.
Melissa commented the other day, not fluff. So, yeah, and it's a paradigm shift for me too. You know, I feel like I'm still learning how to do some of this stuff.
One of the paradigm shifts I was thinking about was communication. I used to do a lot of letter writing, especially with older relatives and stuff, keeping up with college friends and stuff, and then it's shifted totally. Now it's text, and it's lost a lot of the personal flavor, and I don't know. You can't draw little pictures or anything in a text.
You have to go
Just
with
an
emojis.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a paradigm shift. But you know, it's fun. One of our nieces on Tom's side will send like maybe 10 words or less. Her texts are about that long, but they're on our birthdays and on this. And you know, it's just cute. That's just her. You don't have to wade through a whole long letter, but just say, I'm thinking of you. You know? Yeah. So I guess each method of communication has its advantages.
Pluses and minuses. Yes.
Another thing I wanted to think about when talking about paradigm shifts, he talks about when Jesus washed the disciples' feet. What was the paradigm shift there?
The teacher became the servant.
The teacher became the servant. And I thought it wasn't really the fact that their feet were washed. That wasn't what they objected to. It was who was doing the washing. It wasn't the servant. It was their rabbi. Rabbis don't do that. It's beneath them, you know. But then the question is, and Brenda Popovich kind of raised this question to me. She said, you know, there are churches in America that make foot washing another one of the ordinances. But she says, you know what, in America, we don't expect that. In fact, it almost feels like an invasion of our space.
Yeah.
We're uncomfortable with the whole concept.
And we have shoes and socks.
And we have shoes and socks, you know. So the thing is, what would be a cultural equivalent of lowering yourself to do something unexpected?
I was talking about that with a girlfriend on Sunday. I was talking to her about this book, and I said, well, so what do you think? And she said, cleaning my toilets.
Waiting on them with their food,
Maybe, yeah.
which you did.
I felt like I could not ever let Natalie in my car. Oh my goodness, so much cigarette smoke just is on her, and I'm like, I will not allow that. And then I'm like, Lord's like, you gonna serve it? And you know, at first I'm like, I'm gonna be so allergic. It's gonna be bad for me. And she got in there, and I'm like, it just got easier every time I pick her up. I'm like, you know, no, I don't really. It's not bothering me because God is working in it. So that was just my boundary. I'm not gonna do that. That's just below me.
Yeah.
To let her in my car was a big deal. First I had blankets all over my seats, and then I didn't. So I don't know what the deal is with my issues, but I have more issues than she does in some ways. I just have to realize that we're both struggling.
That's a good point, Debbie, that a lot of times the paradigm shift has to occur in us first.
Yes.
You know, not in the other person. Yeah. But just to think about, okay, what are some culturally equivalent ways of serving that we would think are beneath us, and yet somebody last night mentioned the lady in the airport that brushed that old man's hair.
Right.
Yes.
That's
You know.
You know. Yes.
But anyway, just interesting to think about. You know, it's not literally the act of foot washing, but it's the implications of that act that can impact us today. Because probably most of us will never be involved in washing someone's feet unless they're in a hospital bed or something.
I thought she was gonna give him something to eat, what? Brush his hair? Then I thought about years and years ago, some woman in Detroit was living in I don't know, sewers or something, and they took her out, and she had all kinds of pestilence in her hair.
Yeah,
They cut all of her hair off
yeah,
and fed her.
yeah. But helping with people like that, you know, takes an amount of grace. You know, and God has to give that, so. The other one he talked about was Jesus healing the deaf and mute. I think that's on page 102. What struck you about that encounter? Anything stand out to you in that
That he
story?
took him aside,
That he took him
the
aside.
spotlight.
Deaf man didn't ask.
Right, well, and in fact, he couldn't, because he couldn't speak. And Jesus couldn't explain to him what he was doing, because he couldn't hear. So you notice he didn't ask him, what do you want me to do for you? Like he did some of the other people, make them actually spell it out. But I thought it's very interesting that in drawing him aside, he was getting his attention. And then in touching his ears and literally touching his tongue, he was saying, because he couldn't explain yet, I'm going to deal with this problem and this problem. So the man understood, but he did it in private. Do you think, with that kind of, those kinds of disabilities, how much mockery did he endure as a child, or probably still as an adult? How many people followed him around, you know, trying to make fun of his noises coming out of his mouth? Jesus spared him that. He said, you come here. I mean, so, the fact that he was willing to touch him, he got in close proximity, he was acceptable to Jesus, and just communicated that by touch. And that he was very personal with this man. And then what was the last P? Power. Of course, we don't have that power generally, but we do have the access to pray. And so we can pray that that power would be shown in their lives, and they would know that God has been here, you know, in their lives. So I didn't really, the last thing was just at the end of the chapter where it gives this other little acronym, the RPMS. And I thought the questions on page 110 and 111, they're very similar to the questions that Tom asked in Sunday school last Sunday, you know, the checkup questions, how are you doing? But I thought, again, these give you maybe some new ways to pray for the people that are on your list. As you go through those questions, how are they doing relationally, if you know? You know, you happen to know because you've overheard there's a lot of shelling going on in that house, you know, you can pray for peace, or just whatever, you know, how are they doing physically? And again, do you know, or is there a way you can find out? Or ask God to reveal something to you, give you, you can pray for them. How are they doing mentally? Do they seem down? Do they seem mood swings, you know, what kind of things are shown up there? And then, how are they doing spiritually? And obviously, some of these things take time as you get to know them, you will discover those things. But again, this gives you some more ways to pray for them, maybe that you hadn't thought about. So is there anything else from this chapter that you wanted to mention or that stood out?
Being sensitive to understand needs beyond what the obvious is, I think that's a big one I need to work on. You know, sometimes the needs are real obvious, but Jesus looked beyond the mute and the deaf, and he saw his emotional needs.
Yeah. Yeah. And just asking God to give you those kind of eyes. Yeah. All right, so for next week, we'll go on to the next chapter about the last S in bless, the story. How to tell our story of the blessing that we have received. All right, and we do have some time. So again, if you would like to spend some time in prayer, you may. If you can't, you can feel free to leave, but